Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's AAIB Bulletin Debrief from Final Descent UK. We've got 6 accidents and incidents to discuss this month, so let's get to it. Although not in Bulletin as yet, as the investigation is only just beginning, I'm briefly going to touch on the Southend King Air crash on Sunday the 13th of July. So what do we know so far? Well, the Beach Super King Air registration Papa Hotel Zulu Alpha Zulu crashed very shortly after takeoff from Southend Airport. It was owned by Zutsch Aviation, a Dutch company specialising in aeromedical retrieval, transport and survey missions. It seems from sources that the plane had just completed such a medical retrieval flight from Pula in Croatia to Southend and was just returning to its home base of Lelystad in the Netherlands. 4 people were on board, which would be pretty standard crew for a retrieval mission of 2 pilots, a doctor and either a nurse or paramedic. In this case, a nurse was on board, and tragically we know that she was on her very first day working as a flight nurse. The ADS-B data shows the aircraft backtracking down the runway at Southend for a takeoff on runway 05, apparently becoming airborne at 106 knots ground speed, reaching approximately 175 feet of altitude in an almost immediate left turn after leaving the runway, crashing on the northern airfield boundary next to Rochford 100 golf course. Videos and photos show an intense fire, and an air exclusion zone was set up by the Civil Aviation Authority around Southend Airport, which is still in place at the time of recording this video today on the 16th of July. An eyewitness said that about 3 or 4 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft banked heavily to the left and became inverted within another few seconds and crashed head first into the ground. Now, what I'll say next is speculation, but the left bank could suggest an issue with the left engine, and lots of people online are talking about the power lever migration issue affecting King Air aircraft, which is an uncommanded movement of the power lever, which has been the cause of similar crashes in the past. It's an issue which is extremely variable amongst individual aircraft of the same model, and the worst case scenario is that after takeoff, the left power lever moves to idle, and all of a sudden you have a situation with full power on the right hand side and essentially an air brake on the left as an unfeathered propeller winds down and causes a significant amount of drag. Crashes caused by this issue have all followed a similar pattern to the crash at Southend of a rapid bank to the left and collision with the ground. King Air's own website has a video demonstrating this, showing that if the power lever friction is set too loose in affected models, the left power lever tends to move itself to idle in certain circumstances. We should get an initial report from the AAIB within 30 days. We'll keep everyone updated here. The first incident from Bulletin this month concerns a Loganair ATR 42 operating its 4th sector of the day between Sunburg in the Shetland Islands and Glasgow. The aircraft took off from runway 27 at 11:29, turning onto a southerly track, climbing to flight level 180 on the Yankee 905 airway to the Aberdeen VOR beacon. At around 12:01, the commander described hearing a big thump, and the aircraft immediately yawed to the left, which was corrected by rudder trim by the autopilot. The engine 1 torque had reduced to nearly 0, and the engine temperature was rapidly increasing. The master caution warning, engine 1 over limit, appeared, and the co-pilot began to start the relevant checklist, but this was interrupted by the engine 1 fire warning. So the crew switched to that checklist and both fire bottles were discharged, which successfully extinguished the fire. The co-pilot declared a mayday to Scottish Control, and the commander began to descend to flight level 130, subsequently diverting to Aberdeen, where they landed with 1 engine inoperative at 12:28. After landing, a ground engineer reported that there was fuel leaking from the number 1 engine. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were downloaded, and the data was consistent with the crew's account of the incident. The aircraft was examined, and there was evidence of fire around number 1 engine cowlings, and an inspection inside revealed further evidence of fire damage and sooting. The fuel return line was found to be loose and leaking. The aircraft manufacturer reported to the AAIB that they had no recorded in-service instances of fuel return lines becoming loose before. Inspection of other areas of the engine identified that the second stage power turbine had suffered significant damage and other turbine stages also had visible damage. The engine was fully disassembled in Canada, and this revealed the number 6 bearing had suffered significant degradation, resulting in the loss of a location of the high-pressure turbine assembly, causing damage to the turbines and their casings. The AAIB considered that the violent nature of the engine failure, as evidenced by the dramatic and sudden reduction in torque, caused the fuel return line to whip and loosen the connection, and then for subsequent vibrations to loosen it even further, hence the fuel leak. There is no locking on the connection, and as you can see from the image, there is a 90-degree elbow which could add further leverage to any loosening forces. The aircraft manufacturer has commenced a safety review to identify any possible safety actions which would further reduce the likelihood of a leakage from the fuel return line, which they expect to complete by the end of this year. The first accident from general aviation this month concerns a Piper PA-18 registration Golf Charlie Uniform Bravo X-ray on the 27th of August 2024 at Croft Farm airstrip in Worcester. The 65-year-old pilot with 1,520 hours experience, but only 3 on this type of aircraft, was unfortunately killed in the crash. It was only the pilot's second flight in the accident aircraft, and the first time he had flown the aircraft solo from the front seat. He had some initial trouble starting the engine, but eventually taxied out for a departure from runway 28. The flaps were seen to be retracted as it entered the runway to backtrack. CCTV captured that whilst the aircraft was at low speed during the takeoff roll, it swung to the left before being realigned with the runway centerline. After that, the rest of the takeoff roll appeared to progress normally, with the tail wheel lifting off just before the aircraft went out of view of the CCTV cameras. 9 seconds later, it reappeared in a CCTV image close to the camera in a steep nose-down attitude just before it struck the ground. Although image quality wasn't the best, it did appear that the wing flaps were still retracted before the crash. 2 eyewitnesses described the aircraft's initial climb as steeper than expected, but that the engine note was normal throughout the short flight. Furthermore, one witness described the aircraft's left wing dropping and the aircraft entering a steep left turn, after which it began to descend, striking the ground. The post-crash fire was intense and had started within 3 seconds of the crash, and the CCTV footage showed the initial position of the aircraft was with the tail almost completely vertically above the nose. Twigs from nearby trees were caught in the tail wheel, which gave a good suggestion of the likely flight path as per the image, but the pilot was using a flight planning app on a tablet which recorded the aircraft's GPS flight path. The path stops short of the accident site by about 3 seconds, likely due to the aircraft's bank angle limiting the visibility of the GPS satellites. The data showed that the aircraft climbed at an average flight path angle of 14 degrees and reached a maximum ground speed of 34 knots before turning left, striking the tree 40 metres to the left of the grass strip. The aircraft has had a quite interesting history. Originally constructed in 1981, it was first registered in Greece, having 3 other registrations before being transferred from Germany to the UK in 2021, where it underwent extensive modification to include an Alaskan bush fit, which includes large tundra tyres and a belly fuel tank. It was involved in an accident at Slape Airfield in 2023, whilst registered as Golf Charlie Lima Yankee India, when it flipped over onto its bank whilst braking heavily shortly after landing. After that, it spent 13 months undergoing repairs, and it was re-registered in June 2024 with the current registration which was involved in the accident. Only a month later, it was returned to the repair workshop as the owner reported that it was rolling left in flight. It was found that during repairs a new wing strut had been fitted and there was a 2.5 degree difference between the right and left wing incidence angles. That was corrected and the rolling problem was reported as being resolved. Other issues included inoperative spark plugs, timing problems with the right magneto, and poor condition of the ignition harness, all of which were also resolved. An engineer also thought that the left flap was deploying slower than the right, however, they were stopping in the correct positions. Examination of the wreckage showed no evidence of any failure, and a post-mortem examination showed multiple unsurvivable injuries. Although it was only the pilot's second flight on this aircraft, he had flown tailwheel aircraft almost exclusively recently, including a Piper Cub, a Harvard, and a P-51 Mustang. He'd also flown regularly from Croft Farm and was familiar with the strip. There were no significant underlying medical issues. At the side of the grass strip, there's an electrified fence, and as we've discussed previously, the aircraft was seen lurching to the left during its takeoff roll. The AAIB theorised that the pilot likely elected to take off earlier than intended to avoid the fence, and this could have been a contributory factor in the accident. In a previous video, I've explained how various factors in single-engine propeller aircraft come together to produce significant left yaw and roll, which must be overcome by pilots to maintain straight and level flight, especially in high-power scenarios such as takeoff. It's likely this was a factor here, and the pilot became airborne at relatively low speed without flaps deployed and in a semi-stalled condition, which would have given him very limited aerodynamic control to correct the roll and yaw to the left, leading to the collision with the tree and the subsequent crash. Pulling up would have been an instinctive action to avoid the trees, but this would have caused the wings to stall further and exacerbate the issue. In conclusion, the investigation wasn't able to establish a definitive cause for the accident, though it is likely that a low-speed liftoff led to the pilot having insufficient control authority to counter any flight path divergence. There was no evidence of pre-accident fault with the aircraft. Unfortunately, there's a second fatal accident in this month's bulletin, and it took place on the 5th of June 2024, involving a mini Nimbus Glider registration Golf Charlie Foxtrot Hotel Golf near Ballavingdon in Sussex. The 73-year-old pilot with 100 hours flight experience was intending to conduct an endurance flight of around 5 hours, and in the early stages of the flight, the pilot was successful in gaining height in 2 thermals. After 30 minutes of flight, he turned 180 degrees and began to track back to the airfield, but eventually descended below 900 feet, which is the height at which the British Glider Association suggests a field landing should take place. At around 1:30 p.m, a member of the gliding club who had been following the progress of the club's gliders online noticed that the flight track for the accident glider had stopped and assumed that the pilot had landed out in a field and that he would arrange his own recovery, as was normal practice. The member arrived at the club later and inquired about the accident pilot, and it was only then that he found out that a 5-hour flight was planned and that nobody else at the club was showing any concern because it was only just approaching the time of his expected return. They attempted to call the pilot, but there was no response after 15 minutes, so the member and another pilot took off in the club's tug aircraft. Eventually locating the glider crashed in some trees, and they made a mayday call to the D&D frequency 121.5. At the time, the club members were ringing the phone. A dog walker happened to be passing near the crash site and heard the phone ringing. He entered the woods to investigate, and it was only then he could actually see the glider and the unconscious pilot and called 999 himself. Other club members reported that the conditions were challenging, with strong gusts and heavy sink with a strong westerly wind at height. Other members had also landed out in field as they had encountered strong sink. The AAIB recovered flight data from 3 separate devices in the glider, and these showed that in the final phase of flight, a series of turns were made at 400 feet above ground level and 200 feet of altitude was gained, so it appeared that the pilot was still trying to gain height in thermals at a low level. After that, a dynamic event occurred with maximum values of 25 degrees of pitch and 70 degrees of roll, with a corresponding loss of altitude of 280 feet over 4 seconds. It's likely that that data was erratic and those figures are underestimated. A similar dynamic manoeuvre occurred a minute later, And there was also more anomalous flight data from the recorders suggesting that the system was having trouble fixing a location, and during the final phase of flight, the glider descended into a wooded area and came into contact with the treetops. The pilot had conducted a previous landaway near the field of the accident, and in that case he discussed with other members that he perhaps should have chosen a closer field to land, as he had to change his landing site at the last minute as some children suddenly appeared in his selected field. The pilot was a retired doctor and was on some medication for high blood pressure. The report doesn't name this medication, but states that the CAA guidance on the medication is that it is unsuitable for use by pilots who hold a full medical. However, glider pilots are not required to hold such a medical, so it's not particularly relevant here. However, there were anecdotal reports that the pilot was adjusting his own medication dosage in an attempt to manage dizziness, which is a known side effect of this particular blood pressure medication. Despite that, people who spoke to the pilot the day of the accident stated that he seemed physically well and in good spirits. A post-mortem showed severe pelvic and head injuries, both of which were unsurvivable. There was also evidence of vomiting, but it couldn't be said conclusively if this occurred after death or if it was part of a medical episode which occurred prior to the accident. The glider reached the recommended height at which a field landing should be conducted at the red circle shown on this flight path image. However, the flight continued for a further 8 minutes after this point, over fields which presumably would have been suitable for a land out. The AAIB considered several contributory factors to suggest why the pilot didn't make a landing earlier, namely late awareness of reducing options or task focus leading to loss of situational awareness, his previous adverse experience, for example, the field landing not going to plan before, and thirdly, the effects of aging on capacity and decision making, although that's particularly unfair, I feel, as there is limited evidence to suggest that age is uniformly detrimental on decision making performance. So, in summary, the pilot overflew a number of suitable landing sites after passing below the BGA's recommended height for a field landing, and in the final phases the pilot still appeared to be trying to gain height rather than land. There were then 2 loss of control incidents from the second, which was not recovered and led to a crash and sad death of the pilot. There are 2 correspondence investigations in Bulletin this month, and I'll briefly touch on them now. First, a PA28 registration Golf Sierra Alpha Charlie Sierra at Sherburn in Elmi Airfield was performing a training flight where the instructor and student were practicing forced landings, which include 2 touch and goes. After the second touch and go, the ground crew in a rescue vehicle radioed the aircraft to inform them that the right main wheel had become detached from the aircraft and was hanging loose by a hose. The instructor took control and flew along the runway, and the issue was confirmed visually. She flew a few circuits whilst waiting for the emergency services to arrive and then landed on the grass runway 28. The aircraft veered 90 degrees upon landing and came to a stop with the right wheel detached from the hose as per the image. Both student and instructor were unharmed. The aircraft was examined and found that the torque link attachment lugs on the main landing gear cylinder had fractured, meaning the wheel assembly was only being attached by the brake hose. This is a known issue on PA-28 and PA-32 aircraft manufactured between 1961 and 1977, but such cylinders were also fitted to PA-28-161 variant aircrafts up to 1994, which includes the accident aircraft. After this, cast cylinders were replaced with forged ones which were less prone to cracking. Piper suggests that 100 hourly inspections, both visually and then using dye to such lugs, should happen, though this is not mandated in the UK. The accident aircraft had only had a visual inspection, and worryingly, when the operator tested its other 6 PA-28 aircraft, it found that 2 had cracked lugs. The CAA is monitoring the rate of cracks in such aircraft in case it needs to make an airworthiness directive, stating that the gear assemblies need to be replaced. The final incident to discuss involves a Socata Trinidad registration Golf Bravo Sierra Charlie November at Blackbush in Hampshire. The aircraft had been flown on a night navigation exercise and was returning to Blackbush. The pilot was configuring the aircraft for landing and selected the landing gear down. However, only the right main gear and the nose landing gear indicated down and locked, with the left gear indicating an unsafe condition. Various attempts were made to rectify the situation, and the use of the emergency extension system was also done, but it all failed. The pilot conducted a low flyby of the field, and staff informed him that it appeared the landing gear was down, so he elected to conduct a landing. Soon after landing, the right landing gear collapsed and the aircraft came to a stop. Subsequent examination showed there was a fault with the hydraulic power pack, which was running sporadically, stopping and starting at random. The reason that the emergency system did not work was because the gear had already moved to a down position, and the emergency system relies on sufficient downward momentum to force the gear to lock into place. It's not mentioned what kind of repairs were needed to the aircraft after that incident. So that's another month's AAIB Bulletin discussed here on Final Descent UK. Remember to like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, we'll see you next month.